Glenn, we have a good community question this week. It is, why does divorce make people so ugly?
That's a good one, man. It's going to be personal, factual, mixed in.
Mostly personal.
Mixed in with some good feedback and advice. So.
No, we have some good stuff for you guys. Let's go ahead and jump straight into this, starting with, welcome to 12-Week Relationships. This is your place for better relationships in weeks, not years. And when we say relationships, Glenn, we mean all of them, starting with yourself and working outward.
Absolutely.
Today, and my name is Pye.
I'm Dr. Glenn.
So today we have this topic of why does divorce make people so ugly? But first, I do want to talk to you about, I actually want to do a blind taste test of this.
Okay.
So I like supporting American-made products, and wherever possible. And Jocko, I love Jocko. Hopefully he runs for president one day. Hopefully he doesn't take this energy drink with him. Or if he does, it's heavily modified. Because I got these Jocko Discipline energy drinks. Dude, they taste like ass.
Does it?
Like, you expect like an energy drink to like have, I don't know, it's not supposed to be the best tasting thing in the world, but this, I want you to taste that.
It's got to be good for you though. Rule of thumb, if
Good
it tastes
for you?
like,
What
if it
energy
tastes
drink
like
is
ass,
good for you?
like usually like really good things like bitter vegetables taste
This only
like crap,
applies to
but
like
it's good for you.
Asian medicines. This doesn't apply to anything else.
It's not that bad.
Really?
The aftertaste is weird,
The aftertaste is really weird.
but it tastes like Diet Coke. Like that aftertaste because there's no sugar in it, but it's just like to the extreme.
Yeah, like the aftertaste has more of a taste than it's not really an aftertaste because there's the before taste and then there's the taste, which is the aftertaste.
Yeah, and it lingers. It's still in my mouth.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Man.
Well, it's called Afterburn Orange. So you're getting the afterburn right now.
It's still staying.
It's lingering. Okay, let's get to this, my friend.
All right.
I thought this was a really great question that someone had asked, and we do keep our questions anonymous, so those that are submitting. But yeah, why does divorce make people so ugly? This is a question that I asked myself going through this process. Why don't you get started with it? What would you say is the first thing?
Well, I mean, I think number one is just a painful experience, right? Because when you're married and you're staying together and all of a sudden you're not going to be together, that's just a hurtful experience. And then ideally, I think, you want to be responsible, but at the same time, like kind of it all gets enmeshed together. The pain, trying to figure out what's best, the sadness of it ending, all of it, it just all gets combined.
I mean, it's kind of wild to me that divorce is so painful, given that literally, depending on where you look, I mean, 50% of marriages are going to end, right? And if you look in certain countries, it can be 70 to 80%. In other places, the best numbers are like 40%, depending on, again, how long is the study length and what country and what demographic are you looking at and whatnot. But we can say just 50% of these end. For something that has such a high failure rate, you'd expect us to be a little bit more used to it, like accustomed to, okay, this might not go the way that we want it to. So let's maybe be ready for it.
But I mean, it's, the whole romantic notion of forever is tied to marriage, right? So it takes the practicality out of it because 50% is really high, right? Like that means that basically it's a pick 'em that this will last or not last. So from a practicality standpoint, you should be more aware and more realistic. But people's view of like fantasy and forever, it just clouds everything.
Well, nobody goes to the altar even thinking that is a remote possibility. That's what is so strange to me is that, I photographed probably 1,000 weddings plus at this point. No one ever goes, or at least I could probably count on two hands the number of people in this 1,000 who were at all realistic about their marriage. Like, yeah, like we're going to give this another go and I'm going to try this again. The first one didn't work out. There was a handful of those people. Nobody goes to the altar going, it's possible that this might not work out. They think that they are, the forever couple.
But do you feel like maybe that's not healthy?
That's tough to say because I think back to I'm thinking back to, okay, we just watched the latest UFC where Amanda Nunes got somehow beat by Juliana Pena.
Yeah.
But nobody enters a fight thinking that they might lose. Why would you do that?
But I think the healthy fighters do, though.
Do they? I don't think so, dude.
I think like, okay, so in fighting, I feel like there's different stages. Like there's the fighter that goes through the invincibility stage where they're like undefeated and they're like, no one can beat me. And then they take a lot of punches and they have a big bravado. But eventually they lose. They lose and then their mortality kicks in and they're like, wow, I'm not that invincible anymore, right? And then they have to go back and then they have to deal with the fact that they're not invincible, but they still have good skills and they have to really evaluate themselves and really be honest about who they are. And then those people that do that, those are the ones that become even stronger and they're more resilient because they know they can lose. They felt the loss and they've overcome it. So from a mental and emotional standpoint, they're much stronger than the person that I'm invincible. That person, like to my opinion, 99% will always win out.
But I think we're talking about two different things, because what you're saying is that, and I would agree with you that what you're saying is like, being open to the idea of losing and being willing to push forward, right? Mm-hmm. What I'm saying is that a fighter doesn't enter the ring. They don't choose to fight someone thinking that that person is going to beat them. Nobody would take a fight if I'm like, you know what, that fighter is just outclassing me in every way, but I'm going to take this fight. They wouldn't do that. They go into the fight because they believe they're going to win.
See, I don't think so. I feel like
what?
No.
What?
I feel like if you're a healthy person, like for example, like certain fighters, like man, this person's they're way stronger or they have a different skill. You're gonna have to work your way through practice before the fight to get yourself mentally into that place. But I think a lot of people they're like, oh, I don't know if I'm gonna win this fight. I think if you do that, then you're in a healthier space. Where if you're like, oh, I'm gonna win this for sure, there's a level of denial. And then that means like when the fight gets really difficult, you're going to break.
I mean, you've seen the press conferences. You've seen how adamant people are about the fact that they're going to win, that they're going to beat out someone else. It could be a lot of bravado. It could be just a show. Maybe in their head, they're thinking something different, but this might be the first time I'm going to agree to disagree with you. This isn't the first time,
but going back to the marriage analogy, that's my point is like when I was doing when working with people that were consciously uncoupling, right? Uh-huh. The number one thing, it wasn't about like having the romantic like fairy tale ending. It was the fear of being alone.
Yeah.
Like that was a core of it more than the fantasy.
Sure.
And so similarly, I feel like when you enter a marriage or you enter a competition, if you're really realistic, but you do the work and you're like, this is what I need to do, you're in a much healthier space.
I just don't think, just like the fighter analogy, I don't think that's the majority of people that are getting married. I don't think the majority of people that are getting married, at least not in their first marriage, right? The majority of people getting married do not go into it with this emotionally expanded mindset of, there's a possibility that this doesn't work out, but I'm going to reach my higher self and I'm going to do this. And I think they go into it because they're deeply in love and they think that they're going to beat the statistics. They're going to beat the odds.
True, but also there's a realism there. Like if you know why you're doing it, and then you're very honest about yourself, the chances become even higher. Like Juliana Pena, do you think when she thought, oh, I'm gonna 100%, no doubt I'm gonna beat her? I'm sure like during the training camp, they're like, you're probably gonna take a lot of punches. You may get knocked out.
Yeah, there's always the plan.
There's a reality. She knew, like even in the interview, she was like, she knew they were like the game plan was they knew that she was gonna get hit a lot. She knew she was going to get punched to the face and she had to like eat punches to get in.
Sure.
There's an acceptance of, and through that process, I might get knocked out. But she still had the game plan. So she was expanded enough knowing that through this game plan, I might get knocked out.
For sure. But to this point,
yes.
This is like one of the best conversations we've had.
Because we're talking about UFC.
We have blended now UFC
and marriage
into our relationship.
Yes.
Okay, careers here. But to that point, we're asking why is divorce so ugly in so many cases, right? And I think it's that lack of preparation that what you're talking about right now. Because again, going back to the fighter analogy, the fighters that do feel invincible, the ones that have not prepared for the possibility, when they lose, it's a train wreck. I mean, they're up there crying, they're sobbing, they're screaming like this was I won this fight, and they're not, we would define them as sore losers, right? But they're not really that. What it is that they haven't prepared themselves for the possibility of what just happened. And so what you're seeing is this emotional breakdown at that point. And most fighters, I think they do prepare themselves. I think by the time they get to that stage, they have prepared themselves for the possibility of failing. I don't think people going into marriage have. I think that when the divorce is actually a reality, that's when the emotional preparation begins, and this vision of what they had, this fairy tale vision of what they believed that they were and that they were going to beat the odds and all those things, I think it comes crashing down all in that moment. And they start rewriting their entire identity, their whole history, everything, all while going through the divorce process.
But like when the way you're describing it to me, like I hear it like you're putting all your eggs in one basket, and then there's a level of denial in that.
That's exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying that why is divorce so ugly? Because, if 50% of divorces end in, or 50% of marriages end in divorce, roughly, I'm saying that nobody is preparing for that possibility.
Agreed.
They're going into it thinking that they are beating the odds. They're going into it thinking that they have the fairy tale, and the reality, the acceptance, and the potential expansion doesn't happen until the moment the divorce is real.
Agreed. And that's why like prenups are not done a lot of times, because
Correct.
They're like, oh, this is an insult to our marriage.
That's exactly how it's treated. It's treated as like an insult, or like you don't have faith in us, you don't believe in this, like.
Right. Versus like, okay, well, I mean, it does end in divorce, but if we last, we last, right? Like we can do both.
Mm-hmm.
They're not mutually exclusive. Two things can be true at one time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So for an institution that has such a high failure rate, I would think that the number one reason divorce is so ugly is because there's very little to no preparation for the possibility of this going south.
Agreed. And
there's no emotional preparation. There's, we look down upon the prenuptial agreement. That stuff doesn't exist because it's not supposed to be a possibility.
And then if your marriage is healthy, you're going to talk about those things and say, yeah, we can beat the odds. But yeah, let's go there and let's explore it so that we can make our marriage stronger.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a positive. Not talking about it just makes it worse.
I just wonder how many first-time couples are having that open of a conversation. You know what I mean?
I don't think they are. I mean, I think the more mature ones might.
Yeah.
Like in some, maybe in a more indirect way, but like, a lot of times couples don't work out, and what are we going to do about that? Or I don't know. Yeah, you're right. I don't think most people do. They're just planning the wedding and they're thinking about the fantasy versus the reality.
Yeah, I think it might be different, depending on, again, demographics and where you are, right? Because I would say in a place like Utah, where the majority of people are getting married very young, early 20s, they're getting married. It's a highly religious environment. And I would say that, just anecdotally, 98%, 99% are not having these discussions beforehand, because this marriage is of God. We are to be forever. This is, and so there is no preparation whatsoever. And the downside too is that the statistics doesn't, favor religious marriages or getting married at a certain time or anything like that. It's the same. Doesn't matter whether you're Jewish Orthodox, doesn't matter whether you're Mormon, doesn't matter whether you're Muslim. 50%, that is the rough number that you can kind of like accept, right? So for the young group going into this, I don't think there is any preparation whatsoever. If you're 30s to 40s getting married for the first time, I think there is more of a preparation. Like you're a little bit more realistic.
Well, I mean, 50% on average is divorce, but if you look at the age of 22 to 28,
mm-hmm.
that group has the highest rate of divorce. I think it goes to like 70, 80%.
That's crazy.
And the reason is because think about like when we were that age, you're at that age, you're trying to figure out who you are as a person. That's the level of individual development. So if you're not individually developing and you're trying to create this family and couples, like you're trying to bond together, that's going to ruin the relationship because mm-hmm. you're not at that stage mm-hmm. to do it. Mm-hmm. So that's another factor as well.
Well, and going back to this idea of why is divorce so ugly, so you're explaining that at this 21 to 28 stage, this is the place where you're forming your identity, right? When you've married in that time frame, when you're supposed to form this identity, and I would think that, this could happen outside of that time too. But let's say up to the point that you're 28 years old. If you're married before that time, a huge part of your identity is going to be being married, because that came into your life at a point where you were trying to identify who it is that you are. And a huge part of who you are is being a husband or a wife to this other person. So when that other person says, I don't want this anymore, they're ripping that identity out of your hands. And again, you're going through this tumultuous, I have to find myself and redefine this identity and do all of this in the midst of someone pulling this away from me. And the anger directed at that person, it's going to be all the anger for all the personal work that they should have been doing, but they haven't, is directed to that person in the middle of a process of trying to divide assets.
Well, the other thing too is you're mourning two things. You're mourning the loss of the marriage. But then if you were a really good spouse during that age range, that means that to become a good spouse, you're sacrificing the growth period and the selfishness to be the person you wanted to be. So you're also mourning that.
Yeah.
So that's a dual thing that you're mourning at the same time, which I'm sure is going to breed a lot of resentment.
For sure.
Yeah.
And I've seen people that, it's not to say that all divorces go this route, right? I've seen people do contract couplings and mediation. I've even seen people work through divorce lawyers, and it's fairly amicable. The difference, though, is that both people knew who they were beforehand. They knew who they were going into the marriage. It didn't work out. They fall back on their identity of who they are. They're not trying to figure, there's no, anger for who I was and everything that you're taking from me in this process. But I do think that those are kind of few and far between.
No, you're right. That's an excellent point, because the older you are, the more you know yourself as a person. So you can fall back to that individuality. The younger you are, you have no idea at that point. So it just becomes worse.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's an excellent point.
Okay. So number 2, we said that there's deep emotions about the failure of the marriage, when really there shouldn't be. Again, this goes back to a lack of preparation, right?
And the pain of just the marriage. A lot of times people point fingers. It's the partner's fault. If they only changed, if they only did this, versus taking accountability for the fact that you chose that partner. You chose to get into this relationship. Why? And doing that inner exploration and understanding your contribution to this relationship.
But I've noticed, just talking about in general, the human condition, accountability is not an easy thing for someone to accept, period. Why is that so difficult?
Well, I think in intimate relationships, it's a couple of things. Like, one, it's such a vulnerable relationship, number one. But number two, like, the more intimate a relationship becomes, the more of your issues come out. And so it's like in your face, and then it's so real. Like, you have a choice either to point the finger and blame it all on the other person, or to really be accountable, which is really hard to do. There's a lot of resistance because the ego's like, no, I don't want to go there. It's the other person's fault, versus doing that deep exploration.
Yeah, I think accountability is difficult just on a day-to-day basis by yourself. I mean, how many books, Jocko's book, since we have, this is not sponsored by Jocko by any means, but Extreme Ownership is literally all about that, right? About just the fact that it's difficult to take accountability and ownership over anything in life, but that is your route to any form of improvement or success. Then you step into marriage, and it's like, the marriage is ending. I don't want to take accountability for this. I don't want to take accountability for my mistakes, or I want to be the one that's right. That is so often the prevailing sentiment. Oftentimes when we begin working with, a couple or even individuals, they will speak of the relationship just they want us to just step forward and say, you're the one that's right. You were right to do this. They just want that validation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even in the couples sessions that we're doing now, whenever it's like the other partner, like, yeah, you need to work on this. The other partner's like, yes. And they get very, very animated, right? But then when it becomes about like, well, what about you? Mm-hmm. Then they get really, really quiet, because it's hard to acknowledge, okay, yeah, what you're doing is not normal, but it's hard to admit what I'm doing is also not normal as well. It's not healthy either. And that level of accountability is difficult for people.
That is such a strange thing.
People shut down. They end up smiling at me at first when I'm talking about the other partner, and then they get really, I was like, I don't like you anymore. Because you have to be accountable for your own behaviors.
This is our 50,000-year-old operating system software that needs to be updated. Like this,
It does.
I mean, it's so difficult being wrong because in the past, being wrong used to mean life or death. So we never wanted to be wrong, right? I mean,
Right.
we're programmed for that. It's instinctual. But today, being wrong isn't life or death. It's normal, like natural.
But it's freeing because when you take accountability, there's a lot of resistance, but then there's a freedom knowing that if I take responsibility for the things I can't control, it's a more empowering experience.
Yeah. I would hope that, this isn't what happens again oftentimes, but in that place where we're going through that kind of, emotional rediscovery of this, who we are, and we're trying to, I don't know, especially when children involved, you would expect that the kids would be the primary focus of, we need to make sure that they're okay. We need to make sure that we do what's right for the kids. We need to do what's equitable for us. But that's not what happens.
Yeah, priorities are lost because that should be the priority, but the emotions and all of the other baggage that comes with it comes into play. That takes priority over the kids and what's best.
Again,
That's
the
lost.
emotions that override everything else.
Yeah, the pain, the suffering, but that once again, that's emotional accountability and maturity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This one's a tough one for me to wrap my head around because I understand the psychology of it. I understand, what people should do, and I understand, all of these things. But to see it play out, even to see it play out firsthand, where I could see my, what do we call my ex? Susie? Was it
Susie.
Yeah.
Susie.
I could see Susie making a lot of bad decisions for the children, and to be completely helpless to do anything about it. And I still have a hard time wrapping my head around why, mainly because I'm looking and I'm trying to understand from my perspective and my set of core values. And I can't, because we have two completely different sets of values. But that's a difficult one.
You mean like you can't looking back, you can't understand why you chose that marriage in the first place?
No, I look at the divorce process of like why it went the way it did. And I still have a hard time understanding why she chose to make certain decisions along that way, because they were clearly not the right decisions for her or for the children or for anything. They were out of anger. But when you're there and when you're in that moment, even with what I knew, I couldn't explain it. I couldn't understand it because my value set was so dramatically different.
I see. But your priorities were about the kids and about what's best. You're seeing the bigger picture, knowing that you guys are no longer together, where she was still probably in the phase of, oh, it's your fault. And you caused all this to happen. She just wasn't there.
But and that's what I'm saying, is that it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter where I am versus where she is. You're gonna, the dynamic is gonna operate on the lowest common denominator, right? Like you're gonna operate on that level. So to give you an example of this without going in depth into like anything too personal, it would have made a lot of sense for us to say, we're gonna split the assets 50-50.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to agree to a support amount, and we're going to do all this on our own, versus, and we can do mediation, right? And I kind of was saying this from the beginning. It would make a lot more sense to do that versus if you go and hire a lawyer and I go and hire a lawyer, we're looking at, I think my lawyer was $350 an hour. Hers was like $450 an hour. And then they're going to spend, 100 hours on this thing each. So I'm sitting here going like, this is $250,000 that's potentially just going to be lost, thrown away in this process. It could go to you and to me and to the children, instead of to the lawyers. But that wasn't a possibility in her mind. In her mind, it was, no, I am deserving of everything I'm going to get, and I'm going to hire the best because you're going to take advantage of me. And I'm like, what is there to take? These are the conversations that were going on. What is there to take advantage of? We just split it and we just do it on our own. Like, what do you mean? And so there's such a level of anger and fear and all these things mixed into it that she went down the route of, she's going to have the best lawyer. We end up spending the money on that. And $250,000 just goes straight to attorney's fees. And I have a hard time of like just understanding. That was one amongst 20 decisions that were bad for the family and bad for the children. And I'm thinking in that moment, I can't even understand the thought process. I have a hard time because my values don't allow me to like put myself in those shoes. You know what I mean?
Let me ask you this. So through the process, how did you cope through that? Because you had your priorities straight, but I'm sure there was a lot of like resentment and frustration that you were trying to work through at that time.
Oh, for sure.
How'd you work through all that?
I don't know. I mean, I was meeting with you. We were writing it was funny. I was actually probably my coping in a lot of it was just the work that I was doing. The work that I was doing to my hope in doing the, research project and the writing. And this was all during that time. And my hope was that this pain would eventually prevent my children from going through the same thing and also might be useful to other people. So that was kind of my primary way of dealing with it.
So it was like, instead of we can't work, me and Susie cannot work this out. So I'm going to have to indirectly figure out another way to make this work for our kids.
Yeah, I mean, there was nothing to do on that side. It was just, I'm going to hire my lawyer and we're going to let lawyers work at this together type thing. So the emotional energy I just kind of redirected toward work and towards this project.
Well, that makes sense too, because once you guys lawyer up, it's like enemy lines are drawn.
Yeah.
And there's nothing else that you can do. It goes through the lawyers at that point anyway.
Well, that was the third point that we had too, that
Yeah.
when you get to the actual divorce process, and it doesn't matter whether you're going through mediation, doesn't matter whether it's just the law, the way that the law is set up itself, it's an adversarial system. So like if you decide to get divorced, the law looks at you and says, okay, now you two have to basically battle it out to figure out who's going to get what.
Yeah. And one of the research, one of the interesting things is like legally you guys are enemies. So one of the worst things that you can do is actually have a discussion with your spouse during that time about what you would like, because that'll be turned against you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's like the worst thing you can do. So once it's lawyered up, it's like you shouldn't talk to your partner at all.
Yeah. We found that out too.
Yeah. You had
I
that
found
experience too?
Yeah. There's no point in discussing anything, and anything that was shared, even like, nice things that I was doing to try to like help out, all of them would later get used against you. And, in that discussion, in the mediation process, in the lawyers kind of discussing who's going to get what and all of it.
It's kind of scary, like to me, like just talking about it right now, like it goes to two extremes. Because one, there's the fantasy of forever,
Mm-hmm.
and then the reality of it's 50%, 70 to 80%, depending upon your age range. And then you guys are the enemy if this doesn't last.
Mm-hmm.
It's like there's really no in between.
Yes. And I would say that it's not even really 50%. Like, I think it's important to understand this is why, again, going back to number one, like being prepared and having a premarital plan, like a prenup. You need some sort of an agreement. It doesn't have to be anything difficult or anything crazy. It's just, if this goes south, like you take what you brought, I'll take what I brought. We'll split whatever we created together, 50-50. Anything that, I didn't help you to do, you didn't help me to do, that's our own things, right? But this process gets even worse when you're a business owner. So the law goes, you think the law is 50-50, but it's really not. Because if you work a job, right, then you could say it's 50-50. Because whatever your income is, then you're just going to take a piece of that. That's going to go towards alimony, child support. Plus, you're going to maintain the marital standard, whatever assets you had, the home, all that kind of stuff gets divided 50-50. But when you own a business, then it becomes, well, she owns half your business too.
Because legally they're saying that she helped you build that business.
Yeah, see, the law doesn't step in to actually understand what went on in the relationship. So I'm going to give you an example. In my case, there was like blatant theft of lots of money during the course of the marriage. And then going up to, for the most part, Susie wasn't present at home. So it was me and my mother-in-law that were raising the kids, and I was working and building these businesses, and Susie wasn't involved in that either. But the law treats it as if she was. It doesn't matter what was going on in the home. It doesn't matter anything. So the law goes, okay, doesn't matter that Susie took money from you because that was household income. So despite it being hundreds of thousands of dollars, it doesn't matter. She did help you to create your business, even though in reality she didn't, but by the law she did. So you have to buy back your ownership. So in reality, it's not 50-50 because a business owner would have to value the business and then buy back the ownership from the other person. Now, if they were involved, that would make sense, right? If they were involved and they want to do that. But if they're not involved, if this was not like, again, the law looks at the marriage and goes, we're going to assume that both spouses were equally present, that they were equally, involved in the mistakes and everything that was done, that they're both good parents, that they're both this, they're both all of that. But it's not the case. And I get why the law is set up that way, because they don't have the time. Their legal system doesn't have the time to jump into these details, right? But from going through it, you go, this is not a fair system.
Well, it's based on a lot of assumptions, though. And then once again, it goes from the fairy tale to the reality and the legal system of you guys are enemies, and it rewards bad behavior. Like from that point of view, like you did all of the work and the building, and then if you just kind of sit back and don't do anything, like you get rewarded for just not doing anything.
Basically.
Yeah.
Like you get rewarded by hiring the lawyer and by making it as adversarial as possible for one person, So again, this is part of the reason why this is such a nasty process, because when you finally wrap your head around this idea and you're going through the anger and the emotional, just that identity being taken from you. And that's kind of the main thing that my ex would say to me is that you're taking this from me. I'm a wife. You're taking this from me. And I'm like, I'm not taking anything from you. You are who you are. But that was what she was processing at the time. Then you drop into it. Well, the legal system is set up to make it so you can take as much as you possibly can,
Well, that's once again, that's a scary thing, because during the divorce process, you are the enemy. But then after it's over, then what? Because those things can linger and transfer over after that.
For sure.
Right? Versus having the priorities of the kids and being amicable and having a healthy dynamic moving forward.
Yeah. Then it goes to figuring out, how do you co-parent?
Yeah. And then how do you co-parent after becoming enemies and then not being enemies anymore? That's like ridiculous. So once again, it goes to these extremes versus this kind of healthy middle ground.
Yeah.
Because it's such a painful process to begin with anyway.
Yeah. I genuinely don't know how to, I know how we can explain how people could repair or work back from this process. But I also think that my case was particularly extreme. I don't think it's a good case study, because I think that I'm on one side of a spectrum. There's the other side of the spectrum where like everything is just happy, happy-go-lucky. Then there's the middle ground of what most people experience. So when it comes to like, how do you co-parent without like this anger and lingering resentment? I don't know necessarily, because from my experience, that doesn't end, because there's constantly the monthly payment. There's the, alimony, there's the continual lies that go on, but now it's involving the children, their schooling and the things that are going on. So there's a constant dishonesty there that prevents any moving forward in the process.
But I think you reflect like what a healthy divorce process is, even if it's really ugly. So whether it's like amicable or it's really ugly, the way that you coped with it is an example of how to do it. You have to be accountable. You have to think about the bigger picture. You have to accept your losses. You have to think about the possibility of your life getting better moving forward. And you're doing that. And then also like regarding like all the struggles, once again, there is no middle ground. Like you're building your life, which is great. And then you have to deal with Susie and all the difficulties that come with that, but you're dealing with it and you're making the best of the situation. So I feel like in that example, in this kind of difficult example, that's what you have to do regardless of how amicable it is.
Correct. In the extreme example, you do exactly what you laid out, which is just, my focus is my children, being the best version of myself in terms of how I am to my partner, and also like, I have a lot of energy I want to put into my businesses and into my family and all those things. And that's where I choose to put my energy. So when things do, repeatedly come up, I just basically choose to redirect energy elsewhere. But I think in a healthy co-parenting dynamic, when each person is accountable, I think you can get to a much, much better place. I think, and we have plenty of examples of this where clients will follow the framework that we lay out and they do become friends again. They do effectively co-parent. They are, they are essentially non-traditional family, and that was always my hope and my dream. But then you realize that in more extreme cases, it's not a possibility because there's never the accountability taken on one side. And so when that's the case and a person just continues down a particular line of behavior, the best that we can do is cut off that person in every way that we possibly can. When there's children involved, there's certain limits on how much you can cut off, right? And then just simply redirect the energy to things that are more productive.
Yeah, so to kind of like simplify what you're saying, like in a motto, is the divorce can be ugly, but you don't become ugly yourself.
Yes.
Yeah, and
yes.
that's what happened. Is like you didn't become ugly throughout the process, and you uncoupled from that relationship dynamic and moved on.
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, there were moments where I remember there was moments where I knocked on your door. And I was like, dude, I need.
But I mean, it was
an impromptu session.
But it was legitimate though. Like it wasn't like these unreasonable things. It was like really toxic.
Sure.
And then you just needed a place to share that.
But in those moments, what I'm saying is that in those moments, there's a, and I guess going back to why divorce is so ugly, because in those moments where someone is doing something to you, instinctually you want to fight back. Instinctually you want to put energy there, and you want to go back even harder because of what they're doing. I've practiced this for I feel like 2 decades now, where just because something is being done to you, there are moments where your best thing is to stand up and defend yourself, to spend your energy defending yourself. There are those moments where you have to do that. But 90% of the time, I would say that your energy is better redirected. Yeah. And knowing when to redirect the energy is like the big thing. So why it gets so ugly is because one person kind of presses the button and the other person presses the button, and you get, this nuclear war going on, and each person just keeps dropping bombs instead of saying, at a certain point, the destruction, like it's worse. If I keep pressing the button, it's just going to get worse. And you have to say, I'm done. So that's, I think, the biggest challenge, and why it continues to get so ugly is because in this process, you have to know, like, there are moments where something is legitimately going to be taken away. That's when you press the button. Then there are moments where you want to simply hurt the other person because how could they? As a person, how could you do that? That's an emotional attack. That's when you lay off. So an example of this would be like custody. When suggestions were being made that I should give up, and I was like, oh hell no. I'm going to push every button here. And I actually went in the other direction, where I actually fought to take custody. I was like, if you want to even suggest this, I will fight and take from you. So that was a place where I was like, I'm going to die on this hill. But then another hill that I was like, this is me just wanting to hurt you for doing whatever. That's where I'm like, fine, take the house. And it sounds like a ton, right? But I'm taking a concession of look, you can take everything. Take all of it. Just let me run my business. And you'd look at that and go, that's stupid, because valuation-wise, you'd be giving up so much. But I'm looking at it and going, if I fight that position, it's another $200,000 in legal fees because we have to do full audits of everything. And I'm sitting here going, if I fire this one, then this is going to damage, this is going to hurt everybody.
It's just going to bring you down further.
Yes.
Yeah. But that's still a tough decision to make, though. But it shows your priorities. It's all about the kids and your growth and to move on. And then you're willing to let everything else go.
Well, I have plenty of my own issues too. And it's not to say that I didn't have those. It's just a matter of I want to work on those, right? I want to work on being dad. I want to work on the businesses. I want to work on all the other stuff, not this.
Can I ask you a question? Is it fair to say, through your experience, and then this is an opinion of mine, but doing the uncoupling process with people, usually for the divorce process, the healthier partner is the one that gets screwed during the divorce process. They struggle the most with it. Whereas the person that's the unhealthiest one, they're kind of thriving in that environment. But then in the long term, after the process is over, the healthier person kind of wins out. Because it goes back to that healthy space again. So in the bigger picture, they went out. But during that divorce process, that's the process where the unhealthy person is thriving.
Correct.
Yeah.
In the short term, you're going to take losses and it's going to be painful. But again, going back to that same kind of analogy, like you could, like in my particular case, it was like I was given two options: give up everything and I could retain my business, my ownership of my business, or do a full valuation on the business and split assets. And speaking with my lawyer, I said, this is, because she was kind of like, I don't really know which is going to be the better route. You're going to know based on your own finances and whatnot. And I go, tell me if I'm wrong. We're going to get an auditor to come in. They're going to do their own audit. That's going to be another person that's going to spend 80 hours running through the financial statements. They're going to hire that one for $250 an hour. Then we're going to want to do our own audit because we're going to want to verify their numbers. So we're going to spend, $150,000 just on the audit itself. Then the two of you are going to sit down and start arguing more points. And I go, is this not how it's going to go? She goes, yeah. I go, could we spend $500,000 in this process? Easily. Okay. So she's asking for all this stuff. Fine. I'm not going to fight back on that one. I'm not firing off my missile on that one. You know what I mean? I'm going to back. So yes, in the short run, the person that is healthier is going to feel, and in reality, you're going to be the person that is probably giving up more in the short term. But then in the long run, the amount of emotional health and the things that you're going to gain from it, it's priceless. The time that I get to spend with my children now, the life that I've built now, everything that I have now, my emotional health. I immediately stopped getting sick. Once I was separated on my own, I wasn't getting sick anymore. Like that was a huge piece right there. Like, oh my gosh, my immune system is not, I thought for the longest time I had some disease that's like making my immune system compromised. So knowing, divorce is ugly because we don't know when to stop fighting. And there are moments where you really have to say, this one is worth fighting and these other 9 are not. Because if you fight every point, it just gets worse.
What was the greatest lesson that you learned? Because it was a painful process. It was really hurtful. There's still challenges, but what was the greatest lesson that you learned from all that? That you're carrying with you today?
I would say my greatest lesson is learning how a small mistake snowballs with time. I kept thinking back to, I knew that there was problems 2 weeks in. I was seeing counseling. 6 months in, I was told by the man who married us that you should get an annulment. This is not going well. And I remember, had I made that decision before the wedding, it would have just been, oh, they were in love. That's silly. Like a little bit of social consequences. 2 weeks into the marriage, it would have been, oh, they spent a few $1,000s and wasted people's time. 6 months in, it would have been like, okay, like, this is a divorce and they're social outcasts and whatnot, but a few $1,000s lost, figure out how to split the, apartment and get things, not a big deal. 14 years down the road, now we're talking losing over $1 million, damaging 2 children that are now caught up in this entire process and like they're emotionally involved with it, splitting assets, dealing with a business that has, 40 plus employees. And I'm like, I got to figure out how to keep this because these people are relying on us to continue this business and to do what we do. And the biggest lesson was just how this would have been such a small mistake had I acknowledged what it was, had I not lied to myself about it. But instead, this arrogance of like, I'm going to fix this. I'm going to make this right. I'm going to work through this. This arrogance of, I can beat the odds. Going back to that same thing. I'm not part of the statistics. I'm not one of the people that are going to, fail. That's just pure arrogance, right? It's that arrogance that, and probably fear too. Fear of like, I don't want to be an outcast. I don't want people to look at me funny. That kept me going 14 years until I no longer cared anymore, until it was a life or death type situation of like, you got to be done with it. And when it was just looking back and going, that was a really small life mistake. But because I didn't acknowledge it, because I lied to myself about it, it became a massive mistake.
How could you have known though at that age of development, the religion, the things that you were taught, like how could you not know that? Right. And to me, like, we're going to push through it, we're going to do that. That shows the healthy parts of you at that age, right? And then to me, like, I think it forced, like, as painful as it was, it forced self-discovery for you. And through this process of self-discovery, look at all the things that have blossomed out of it. Like, I think
Yeah.
that's a great lesson, is like, you, regardless of the circumstances and how painful it was, you always had this boundary of self-discovery and growing and not being this ugly person and really trying to make the most out of it. And it's worked out.
I do think there were a lot of benefits from the experience. And I think, like you said, where I am now, and I have two incredible children, and the life that I have now, the happiness that I have now is simply because of kind of the depth of sorrow that I experienced before. So I do agree with you on that side, but you're asking the greatest lesson.
Mm-hmm.
The greatest lesson would be when a mistake is just a mistake, acknowledge it, own it,
I see.
live up to it, and don't fight it, because the longer you push back, the longer you deny the mistake, it becomes something actually significant.
So it's like Juliana Pena, man. You're like wanting to be the champion. You knew you're gonna take punches, and here you go.
Way to bring it. Way to bring
I'm trying to bring it back, man.
But in this example, we both think that Pena's going to lose the next fight. So I hope I'm not Pena right now. That I'm going to lose the next fight here.
She might not. You never know. Maybe the matchup is just isn't good. You know how certain fighters, like, you just can't beat them sometimes. But anyway.
Well, going into, post divorce, the relationship really becomes now about co-parents and being ex-spouses. In all honesty, like, I've seen some cases where you can amicably split up, and they don't have children, and they do remain friends. That to me is few and far between, because most people don't really want to have anything to do with their ex after the fact, right? But in cases where children are involved, you really don't have a choice. You are going to, you have to communicate to some level, because the children are involved. And so there's no clean break. So what do you suggest to co-parents in that situation?
Well, I think number one is priorities, right? You have to prioritize the kids and the bigger picture, and you have to put that over your own emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And then number two, I think, is understanding that, once again, from a legal standpoint, your spouse is the enemy. But once it's over, they're no longer the enemy. They are the co-parent. They are your ex-partner, but they're also raising your kids as well, right? So there has to be a mutual level of respect,
Mm-hmm.
and that has to be established.
Yeah, that's such a tough one, because you're healing from that whole experience. And then to say, okay, now we're going to work together, because now you're on a team. You're on the team of co-parents.
Let me ask you this, though, because you and Susie, there's not a healthy level of respect. How do you deal with that?
Again, I don't think that Susie and I are a good example of it. I think that I have a lot of good case studies and examples of how it should operate, where essentially both people, we have a lot of these, right, in our clients and in our past case studies, where both people can still be, hurt. They can still be getting over their stuff and kind of moving forward in life, but they acknowledge that the other person is a good parent, that, I appreciate her for being a good mom and him for being a good father. And they work together through each of these they don't communicate and they don't hang out like friends, but they can communicate and say, hey, the kids really want to do this activity. What do you think about this? And they have a good discussion around it. Okay, yeah, this would probably be the best for them. And the focus is just the children. Like, what is the best for the kids? Hey, the kids at my place were, doing this. They mentioned that this is something that they do at your home. How would you feel about something like this? Or what do you think about maybe setting up the same rules in both homes, so that way they're not confused, or it's not, I can do this at my mom's, but I can't at my dad's, and so forth. So you see this like healthy boundary setting, where it's like, we're gonna set up both homes for the children in a way that makes sense for them. But we're not going to step into each other's lives beyond that.
How do you feel, like, so on the flip side, like, let's say it's amicable, where does the friendship line come into play? Should you still be friends, or is that maybe don't even go there and just kind of keep things separate?
I don't know that there's a hard and fast rule for that. Like, from my own research, I don't feel like I found anything concrete on that side. I don't know about you. Have you found anything?
No, I mean, it always just talks about boundary setting and making sure, like, you guys have clear boundaries and prioritize things. But that friend zone, like, let's say it's amicable, where does that fit in?
The only place that I've seen this get awkward, because I've seen couples uncouple even go through difficult divorces and then become really close friends after the fact. And you look at them and they, you would describe them as like brother and sister. There is no attraction whatsoever, but they do have a strong relationship, a good, healthy friendship and relationship that is intimate, right? Because they shared a very intimate part of their lives together. So you look at them and they're like brother and a sister. And where it gets odd is when they start to bring in future girlfriends, boyfriends, and spouses, right? Because then these spouses are stepping into this odd dynamic where these two have essentially, been super intimate. They still are, but now they're not sexually intimate, but they're still parents and so it creates this awkwardness for the outsiders that are coming into the relationship because they don't know where they stand and they don't know how to compete with the history.
I actually dated somebody whose divorced parents, because she was the one in the middle of it. Both sets of parents actually became really good friends with each other and would often have holidays together. That was actually really fascinating to see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's kind of what I hoped for my situation. I don't ever foresee that being a possibility, like for that to happen. But in cases like I was in Hawaii actually, and I saw a non-traditional family where you could tell like we were all at the same resort for quite a few days. So with enough time, you could just kind of observe and see like there was two couples. One of them had been previously married to one another, and now they all had their children there. They were all like really close. And it was a completely natural family dynamic. It was a non-traditional dynamic, but it was a beautiful family dynamic. And I think that's totally attainable.
I think so too. I mean, there's cultural components. Like in Norway, divorce is very high, and it's expected that you're going to divorce because it's a growth process. And you have these non-traditional families that are huge, and they celebrate and share. It should be like that.
Same in places like Sweden and a lot of European countries already have this down.
And then the legal system doesn't treat it as enemies. Like I think in that way, it's a lot healthier than here.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
most definitely.
Yeah.
The last one that we had was, this was a fantastic one. You actually wrote this down from your research, and I was like, I couldn't agree more with this. But you said you need to make the decision of treating your attorney, or you need to make the decisions. Don't treat your attorney as the decider and champion of your cause.
Yeah, so actually that came from the writers of that book. It was under professor's house, and what they're saying is this is where it gets really crazy, because if you're like my spouse is the enemy, and then my attorney is my hero. They're the Avengers. They're like the superhero. They're going to give me everything that I deserve. Once you're in that space, it's just going to make the relationship worse. So you're going to win in the short term, but in the long term, you're going to basically be on enemy lines with your partner, and it's going to affect everything moving forward, especially if you have kids.
Yeah. There was, I can't agree with this more, for the simple fact that if you give your lawyer carte blanche to just go and do whatever they want,
they're going to do what's best for them, and they're going to try and collect as much as possible.
Yeah. And they might have like, I don't necessarily think that I think that divorce lawyers, there are a lot of really great ones out there who are doing God's work. This is a very difficult thing, and there's a lot of them that are doing really great work, and mine included. Lauren was incredible. We're probably actually going to bring her onto the podcast. But I remember my very first meeting with Lauren was my in-house counsel had actually recommended Lauren. And when I went to Lauren, I said, my counsel said that you could be a shark in this process. And I said, that's great, but can you also be nice? Can you fight this the way that I would like to fight it until the point that you have to be a shark? And she's like, absolutely. Absolutely. That is my goal, is to never even let that piece out. But if it comes down to that, I'm ready to defend you, and I'm ready to do whatever it takes. And so we never really, it was always her kind of doing the things that I wanted to do. And it was, okay, Lauren, I'm stuck in this place because this is where we're at. What do you recommend? Okay, let me think about this. But there was never a situation where I was just like, go. Now on the flip side, that is exactly what it was. And that became a battle until there was a moment in our final like settlements where Susie's lawyer, who was he was a shark straight out the gate, like nonstop. And I had to keep telling Lauren, like, it's okay, back off, let him have this one. It's okay, like, let's do this. Then there was a moment where we were sitting down at the table and more of the story kept coming out. And I literally watched his face and his demeanor change. And he actually became an instrumental piece in this whole process, because there was a point where he understood exactly what had happened and what was going on. And he backed off. And I said, this is what I would like to do for us and for the children. I think this is more than fair. He left and actually convinced Susie to agree to it. And that was the moment where it stopped, was like when that switched. But had Susie went into it with the same mindset of like, hey, let's get through this amicably. You're going to do what I would like, instead of just, here's carte blanche, get me what I deserve type thing. It would have been a very different process from the beginning. It would have been, instead of $250,000, it would have been probably $50,000. You know, like, we're talking about a very different experience in all of it.
Well, besides the financial strain, also just emotionally being able to uncouple in a more healthy way.
For sure.
Yeah, and that's what that whole point was, is that if you're dictating the terms, you're sharing with your attorney, besides the financial constraints and all the legalities that are involved, you're emotionally preparing yourself to move on.
Yeah.
Versus if it's the flip side, you're not uncoupling, you're going to still stay and you're going to still be in this pain space and not really learn from it.
Yeah.
So,
for sure. The process is a nasty one.
It's an ugly one.
I do think that there are a lot of personal people that have gone through divorce with accountability and ownership. I think they come out incredibly better. like they're just much, much better people. And I've met many of them now at this point where it's difficult to phase them. You know, like, a lot of things can happen and they know where to put their energy. They know where to put their time. So those of you that are going through such an experience, it's horrible. It's a horrific process. And I wouldn't want my worst enemy to go through this. But at the same time, it is like this refining fire. You are going to come out stronger, better.
You know so much more. You know more than what other people do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there is light at the end of the tunnel. It is going to be much better in terms of every aspect, like not only just personally, but your own health, your happiness, all of those things will get better. But I remember my friend told me, she said at the very beginning of the divorce, she said it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. That's the same advice that I tell people. It's going to get a lot worse, but it will eventually get better.
Yeah. And then on the flip side, if you're not doing what you need to do, you're not being accountable, you're just going to stay in this hamster wheel and stay in the cycle of pain. You may temporarily win, but you still end up losing.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And we see that in one example after another.
Absolutely.
That you can look at these partners 5 years after the fact and you can gauge at that point what exactly went on in the relationship just by how their lives continue from the point of divorce.
That's the ultimate evidence.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
All right, guys. So that was it for this episode. This one got pretty deep, man.
That was a good one, man.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing.
We did say it was going to get personal.
That is true.
So those of you that are looking for individual or couples coaching, jump onto 12weekrelationships.com. That's where you guys can set up an appointment to meet with Dr. Glenn, where you have a free 15-minute consult that you can kind of walk them through exactly what it is that we do and how this framework can help them out, right?
Yeah, individual and group consults. So
individual and couples.
Yeah, so we're seeing individuals as well as couples right now.
Awesome.
Yeah.
In the meantime, we would love for you to subscribe to the podcast. And if you'd like to help us out, you can jump onto the iTunes store and leave us a review if it's a good one. If it's not, just DM us. DM us. And you guys can also find us on Instagram at 12 Week Relationships, where just like today, we are taking questions and we want to kind of come on and create tailor-made episodes for you guys to help with whatever you're going through. So submit your questions. We'll keep it anonymous and we'll bring it onto the podcast. That's it for us. See you guys next time.
Thank you.